Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government. My name's Hannah White, and I'm the director of the IFG, and it's great to see so many of you here in the room today and joining us online for this event on how the electoral system needs to change before 2029 or 2028 or whenever it is that we have another election. As many of you who are tuning in for this event already know, of course, Labour's manifesto in 2024 set out a number of big changes proposed to strengthen democratic participation, including improving voter registration, addressing inconsistencies in voter ID rules, and extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds. So we thought it would be a really interesting moment to have this event to talk about what went on at the election last year, reflect on how that went, and to discuss how the government's plans will affect the way elections, not just general elections, we also have devolved elections and also by-elections and other things happening into the future. So I'm delighted to have a brilliant panel here with me today to discuss this. We're very lucky to have John Pullinger, Chair of the Electoral Commission, who's going to kick us off with a few remarks to start with. Then we'll go into a panel discussion with my excellent panel, consisting of Lewis Baston, political journalist and author, Matteo Bergamini, who is the founder and CEO of Shout Out UK, and Professor Jane Green, who is co-director of the British Election Study. So I'm sure you can tell, knowing them as you will, that there will be a very interesting discussion between us on the stage, and then I will go to questions on the floor. If you're watching online, please use the Slido link to send in your questions online. And if you are online, or even if you're in the room, you can upvote the questions that you like. You don't need to just send in another version of the same question. If it's quite close to the one that you would have liked to ask, please feel free to uprate the questions so they float to the top of my screen and I know which ones people want to really hear the answers to. And just another point, if you're submitting questions online, also if you are asking in the room, it's great to know who you are and where you're from so we can understand that. But I'm going to start by handing over to John.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. You've chosen an interesting moment, as you say, to have this conversation, but also a very important moment. We had the general election last summer. It kind of came rather suddenly at us. But when we look back at how that went, it did actually go very smoothly. We had 650 different contests up and down the UK, and not one of them was contested. In each case, the losers agreed that they had lost. And my shout-out moment of the night was Rishi Sunak's concession speech, which is kind of imparting the kind of dignity of elections, but also the criticality of elections. Something significant had happened at that moment. And it happened smoothly, without fuss, in a way that not all countries manage. We've got 3 elections going on in Europe at the moment, and we'll watch how each of those are managing with them. But that really is something to celebrate. We've had elections in town halls up and down England in the last couple of weeks, and we're currently doing our report on how they went. But a similar situation, quite a dramatic transfer of power in many local authorities and mayoralties. But it just happened. Now, we have to celebrate that, and we have to cherish it and make sure, what do we learn that's good about that? But also, what do we learn we need to change? And the thing that I think has really struck me in the 4 years I've been doing the job I'm currently doing is that we need to recognise that our electoral system is part of our critical national infrastructure. If it fails, we fail as a country. And we need to invest in it to make sure it has the strength to deal with what is going to come and in what we have learned from the elections we've already had. Now, unfortunately, we don't have too much time because elections keep coming. As Hannah has said, we have elections for the Scottish Parliament and the Senate next May. We have elections for the Northern Ireland Assembly the May after, and we have another general election which is going to be coming sometime down the track after that. And of course, we have by-elections and other local contests happening almost every week. But we think to invest, we need to think about 5 specific areas of investment. The first is participation. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that later. It's going down and getting lower, and it's particularly worrying amongst certain groups. We especially want to target younger people, particularly as the government moves ahead with its plans for voters at 16. But also critically important for us, I think, are disabled voters who struggle for a variety of reasons to be able to cast their ballot in secret and in the ways they want to. Second thing we need to invest in is modernisation. We have outdated, inconsistent and horrendously complicated laws for elections, and we need to tidy them up. I mentioned two really particular ones. Hannah's mentioned one already, which is registering to vote. How is it we have a system where 8 million people aren't even on the register? There's got to be a better way of doing that. And for those standing for election, there is a ridiculous mismatch between the regime that applies to political parties and the regime that applies to candidates standing for election. This causes all kinds of problems for them and creates a jeopardy, if you're in that process, for getting the wrong side of the line on some bit of expenditure that you are incurring. Third thing we need to do is to safeguard the system against a whole range of threats. Whilst I said the general election was quite smooth, in some parts of the country it was quite ugly. The levels of abuse, intimidation and threats that are meted out to candidates and many others working with candidates is unacceptable. We need to do something about that. We need to change it. It's also starting to feed across into electoral administrators, who are often the unsung heroes of elections, and we really do need to support them and give them the strength to be able to run the show as is necessary in each community around the country. The Speaker has picked this up and is going to be doing a huge amount of work through a Speaker's Conference on abuse, intimidation and threats, and I'm sure that will bear fruit. But safeguarding is beyond that. There's the whole range of issues around emerging cyber threats, misinformation, disinformation, AI morphing almost by the week into something different that we need to be abreast of. And a final threat which I'll highlight, which is something we've been concerned about and really keen to see legislation on, is foreign money coming into politics and the risk that we haven't got the safeguards that we need to be confident that there is not a route in that needs to be stopped. The fourth item is to think beyond the next general election, think, so what's happening to our society? And this is where learning from other countries is really important. Society is changing, and elections need to reflect the way society is changing, so everyone who is eligible to vote has the opportunity to vote in a way they want to vote, for parties they want to vote for, and have some ability to hold them to account whether they've delivered their promises. So looking beyond the elections, do some convening, bring people together, think, what do we need to think about for long-term investment in the system? And I think local government particularly is an area here where local election teams are run on a shoestring, and that shoestring is getting stretched and stretched and stretched. And finally, and I will just mention the Electoral Commission, which is a great privilege for me to lead, and some of my colleagues are here with me today. It's an amazing group of people, but we too have been running against the grain in many respects in recent years. The legislation that gives the government the power to guide our work needs to be repealed. This is not good enough if you need independence in the oversight of elections. But there's a quid pro quo here. If we're to have independence, we need to deserve that independence. So we need to invest in some of our own internal systems to protect ourselves from cyber attacks, to have good IT, to have good finance systems, to have a good service to those who rely on us, particularly political parties and candidates in the heat of the election campaign, and local administrators, and just be really good at what we do and be held accountable for how well we are doing it. So 5 things I leave you with before we start this debate. We need participation. We need modernisation, we need safeguarding, we need a good debate about the future, and we need to strengthen the Electoral Commission so it can play its unique role in supporting our system over the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Plenty there. I think we might need the whole afternoon to dig into all those issues, but we'll have a go at digging into some of them. Jane, I wanted to start with you. As John was mentioning, participation is obviously absolutely key when it comes to elections. Yeah. But in 2024, we had the lowest turnout since 2001, I think, at 59.7%, which was a drop from 2019. What do you think the factors are that are driving that? Is it possible to say at this stage?
It's helpful that you framed it that way, Hannah, to highlight how different 2024 was compared to 2019. So I think there are two things going on here. One is that we have huge peaks and troughs in turnout. So if you look at turnout in 2017 and 2019, that went up relative to the elections that preceded those elections. And then it crashed down, as you say, almost to 2001 levels. So we have these peaks and troughs. And so to understand peaks and troughs in political behavior, you have to think about context. And therefore, what we know as political scientists, lots of research, I think very widely known actually, and doesn't require political science background to know this, but essentially a lot of the political science research bears this out again and again, that elections that are foregone conclusions or that are high or aren't as high stakes elections tend to determine the level of turnout with those peaks and troughs. And so what we had in 2024 was nevertheless, despite the fact that Labour won on only 34% of the UK-wide vote, a highly widely predicted large majority, which I think, obviously contributed to people thinking they didn't need to go and vote because they were going to get that outcome regardless. This is also what we saw in 2001. So that's the first thing, is that there's a huge amount of this is context. The second thing, however, is that even when turnout has gone up in very high stakes elections, very contested elections in 2017, 2019, it hasn't gone up to the sort of previous levels, which were preceded the sort of Blair years, really, where civic participation in elections was more of a norm. And so you've got real peaks and troughs, but nevertheless, a sense of something going in the wrong direction over the very longest time period. And I think, there's loads of ways we can understand that. One of the things I think we need to point to in particular in 2024 that helps us understand that is that it wasn't just an election that was widely predicted, that was pretty much a foregone conclusion. It was also a disillusionment election. So if you think about the fact that people didn't feel positively about the parties that they were voting for in the main, or certainly positively by historic standards, that goes part of the way to understanding this long-term trend. So people's attachment to political parties, their liking of leaders, their liking of parties, their trust, their engagement with the system has been on a gradual decline. Like I say, with the exception of those peaks.
That's really interesting. Sticking with the theme of the most recent general election, Lewis, this was the first one to take place under the newest changes to the voter ID requirements, which the last government brought in. What's your analysis of the impact that had on voter participation, and what changes and refinements do you think the system now needs?
Right, thank you. There's been a bit of research on the impact of voter ID requirements at the last election. The Commission has done some, the Electoral Reform Society have done some on local elections. The actual numbers turned away from the polling station don't seem to have been that large. I mean, I think it was 16,000 people unable to vote in that measure, which is odd given that the turnout was higher and the electorate was less engaged than it was at the local elections when rather more people were turned away. But probably people turning up at the polling station and being told to go home is not the kind of best measure of the amount of sort of disengagement driven by voter ID. The Commission's surveys found that about 4% of non-voters listed it, sort of said it was the reason or part of the reason for not voting, up to 10% when they were given a list of options. But I think it's that's probably too high an estimate. So voter ID, if we take the 4% figure for the number of non-voters who were deterred by it, it's driven turnout down by 2 percentage points or so, which I think in the big picture, that is actually quite large in the sense of turnout variations between elections. What can we, and also there's the uneven impact of it, which is a matter of concern. I mean, people not having access to ID, different people being disadvantaged by it. So future changes. In an ideal world, I'd say get rid of it. it's complicated, unnecessary, and was a vibes-based answer to, well, was a problem. I mean, the problem was vibes rather than reality. And so we have this policy. But this is asymmetrical. We're probably stuck with it now because scrapping it outright might impact voter trust in the process. So there may be a bit of a one-way door. So certainly liberalise the number of IDs that can be accepted. There are others here more expert in quite how that would work and what IDs would be accepted. There was also, there are these things, voter authority certificates, which are issued. Very low take-up of those. It seems to me in some ways the government since 2010 have been busy inventing use cases for ID cards. While ID cards themselves are taboo. So if the mood changes on that, then national ID cards, say what you like about them, would solve this problem. And the other possibility which the Commission have raised, which I think is a good one, is to allow vouching, that if an accredited elector turns up with somebody who isn't in possession of the relevant ID, they can actually swear, they can attest, and we can let the person vote. So I think liberalising the rules is probably the thing that we can do in the real world, even though scrapping them entirely would be ideal.
John, just because I've had a question that's come in precisely on this theme, and I wanted to put it to you while we're here. So Sean Morris, I think this says Elections Team Manchester, asking about automatic registration. So obviously in some other countries, voters have some form of automatic registration. Obviously that's not where we are. What are the pros and cons of that way of doing things?
Well, we think we can do it, and there have been some very successful pilots in Wales, and the Welsh Government is pushing that forward within the Welsh context. So effectively, it's when you have some other interaction with the state, it kind of automatically enrolls you on the register if it looks like you're eligible to be on the roll in that area. Now, you need some checks because eligibility is quite complicated, but for the vast majority of people, something that's automated that happens just through some other interaction that you've got. So when you get to 18, for example, you would be put on if you've got a national insurance number or some other relevant form of ID, and then that would be checked out. Now, so that is, we think, quite possible. The data are there, and there are other applications where it's been done. I think you need to be quite careful that not everybody does want to be on a public register. We have an anonymous register for certain groups of people, victims of domestic violence, for example, who may want their identity to be protected and not put on a public register. So we would need to pilot and test it carefully. But we certainly believe it's practical, and one of the discussions we're having with the government at the moment is just how we kind of assess that, so we give the public confidence whatever comes forward in legislation will actually work.
Great, thank you. Matteo, also sticking with the theme of the last election, before we move on, you worked with ex-Twitter during the general election campaign, and one of the big themes of what you think about a lot is misinformation, disinformation. How do you still believe it's possible to work with big social media companies on this? Are they doing that in good faith, and what are the next steps we need?
I would say Sean's answer, yes. I think there is a lot that we can still do with the bigger social media companies, and we have done. So we worked with, as you mentioned, X, formerly Twitter at the time, on what was called Ads for Good. So they give ad credits for specific campaigns. For the general election, we had one of the biggest collaborations with them, which was supported by Ofcom and the Electoral Commission, where we targeted specifically political disinformation. And that they gave us what was called a timeline takeover, which is one of their bigger kind of ad assets as such, where anybody that accesses the platform for a specific 24 hours sees our content first. That bit of content got 6 million views in the space of 24 hours. So I think there is a massive value in engaging with these platforms. We're talking to Meta as well about doing other work. We've utilized WhatsApp as a way of creating a chatbot to allow people to gain voter information. So there is a lot that we can do with these platforms. That said, I think we need to be open about the changing social media landscape. So in Mark Zuckerberg's own words, that public square that originally was set up, or that dream that Facebook initially set up, is pretty much dead. For most people, especially young people, they engage with social media on a passive basis, almost like a TV channel where they follow their specific influencers and they consume content passively. What we have now seen is that actually a lot of that political discourse that used to be public has now moved towards closed platforms, so WhatsApp, then you've got, of course, Telegram, Discord, and others. So I think we need to start to engage with those lesser-known platforms more and bring them into the conversation. Because Meta and X aren't necessarily the ones that aren't in that conversation. It's those other ones that kind of skirt under the radar. I would also say that there's a fragmentation of social media platforms. And what I mean by this is something that happened courtesy of the algorithms for the longest period, where you create a bubble almost for yourself on kind of views that you agree with and you share, and then you end up having a timeline that fits your worldview, not necessarily reality. That's almost gone a step further now, and the best example of this is the fracturing between X and Blue Sky, for example, where you've got very distinct audiences now that have specific political ideologies. So that's almost like an extreme version of what the algorithm was creating already. Now we're on two separate platforms entirely. And that obviously shapes the way we have conversations with these platforms. So I'd say that, yes, there is a lot that we can do with these platforms, and I think they are a big part of that conversation of tackling dis and misinformation, because without them, we're not going to gain the same reach. And also, a lot of these issues, let's be frank, are on their platforms. So they need this more than anybody. That said, with the fracturing of these platforms and the changing nature of conversations with young people also means that we need to be more creative on how we engage with these platforms.
So building on that, and I actually be quite interested in both Matteo and Jane's answer to this question. So it's a really interesting distinction you make between sort of being passively consuming information about elections, parties, whatever, and actually doing anything about it. And of course, the first thing that we've been talking about already that you need people to do about it if you want them to participate in elections is to be registered, and we've talked about that. But of course, there's also the question about of the people who are registered, how many actually then go and vote. And I think the figures for 2024, 49 million people on the electoral roll, only 28.8 million actually voted. So Jane, to start with you, and then interested, Matteo, maybe particularly with your perspective on younger people, like what do we need to do to get people to actually vote having registered?
I think there's a question that I think we don't have a really good answer to right now. And so I'd love someone to tell me that I'm wrong, which is that there's this age split in turnout is relatively new, and I don't think we understand it very well. So one of the things I would love to do is to do a really, really careful, ideally funded and resourced piece of research, but we need to understand where this has come from. Our participation divide on the basis of age has opened up in a really staggering way, in a way that honestly, I think we now think is normal, and I'm just here to say it's not normal. And it's arisen, I think, because of the way, and this isn't something, we're talking about really deep, tricky, cultural, as well as institutional, as well as political problems here, right? So obviously I don't want to sort of say something naive, like politicians need to do this, because we can't, we're not in that world, but we are dealing about that confluence of political and institutional and cultural problems. But there's a real political problem here, in the sense that young people have started to feel unrepresented. And if we look at our British election study data, which we can look at contemporaneously, recently, we see that young people don't think that the parties that get power in our electoral system represent them. So they feel better represented by the Greens, which makes sense because the Greens currently do attract voters who are younger. Certainly voters who are younger who have degrees, but also those who are feeling economically insecure. So there's some sense there, but that's a repetitive problem, that we're not seeing parties getting into power that are seen by young people to represent them. And there's this misunderstanding, I think, that there's something normal about this, and it really isn't normal, and we need to understand why young people were voting, and there's quite a clear discontinuity around, again, in the 1990s, early 2000s in this. So that's a big problem. I think the other thing which I was really struck by in terms of sort of understanding young people, I don't think this is a kind of apathy problem. It's going to be apathy for a lot of people, right? That's fine. But there's a really fantastic researcher called Sunshine Hilligus, and she's in America, and she's in California in America. And she did this whole book about young people's voting and participation. She did with John Holbein, a great scholar, really fantastic at public communication and everything else. They really, really did this on a sort of motivation of really worrying about this in America. And they found that they had this thing about grit, which is a very Americanism kind of word, right? But they were talking about young people having a great desire to feel informed before they voted. And so there's something about older generations that have been in the habit of voting, that have seen voting as a civic duty, that maybe has a sort of idea of legacy of what their party stood for. So therefore understand, can have this ideological space relatively well mapped out for them. But the younger people, I mean, it won't be all younger people, clearly, but many younger people felt this sense of kind of, I shouldn't vote because I don't feel I can, because nobody's explaining to me how and who is going to make things better and blah, 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 blah. So I think that's really encouraging. I don't know if it's true here. Again, you know, it'd be great if we could do some more research into this kind of area. And researching turnout's really hard because when you're using the opt-in panels that pollsters and we ourselves at the British Election Study have to routinely use between elections, you're really talking to people who are much more engaged in politics. And there's lots of ways around that. You can do all sorts of things. You can use really, you know, our panel data is really fantastic for many things, but it's not fantastic for studying turnout. So we have a random probability survey that we run after every single election. We're just in the process of getting that ready to release now, but that's expensive and it's rare. So I just kind of, like, you know, if I think about what young people need, they need to feel that politicians, they have a stake in the system and the politicians are listening to them. But more and more, I think they need to feel that they are given the information. And that's not just about go to the polling station and your vote is about this and here's what governments do and everything else. It's about who's going to do what. And I don't think these voter advice applications, I don't think that's quite it. I think it's much more a deeper sense of understanding what parties stand for. And, you know, I did a talk last week for Labour MPs. I'm not sure I could say what Labour stood for right now or what the Conservatives stood for. And I think they're really struggling too because their electoral coalitions have changed so rapidly in such a short period of time. So we're all pretty confused, let alone if you're coming into the electorate for the first time. So I don't have great solutions, but I feel very passionately about that set of sort of diagnostics.
Does that feel?
Yes, if I may add, I think because a lot of our work, aside from the media literacy side of things, is political literacy, and I'm 100% with you on the fact that information is something that is lacking in schools. Like, there is citizenship as a subject, but a lot of schools don't deliver it, don't have the capacity to deliver it or the expertise to deliver it. And whenever we've gone into schools and delivered political literacy, it's kind of like, again, demystifying the system, because I think we've gone past this idea that young people are apathetic. They're not. They care about a lot of issues. Whatever the, you know, depending on which country, like, the young people are not one homogenous group, right? But they do care, as of any other generation. But I'd say that that lack of political literacy is one major barrier. Then actually when we, as part of our role as a secretariat for the APPG on political and media literacy, when we submitted our curriculum review, that was one of the big things we talked about, was the fact that actually schools need to teach this stuff. Because again, it's not something that, you know, you hit the franchise and suddenly it's like a light bulb moment. It's like, okay, I know everything I need to know about engaging in politics. It doesn't work like that. You need to have an understanding of how your democracy functions to be an engaged citizen. But I would also go further and say that one of the big things as well amongst young people, especially when you get your information from things like social media, like, you're seeing young people engage with what they consider direct democracy more than necessarily the ballot box. You're seeing things like petitions, you're seeing things like, you know, sharing or liking for causes or whatever. And quite often there is this kind of instantaneous effect of like, well, I've liked a petition or I've shared something and it feels good because it feels like I've done something. Whereas if you vote, it's anonymous. You often don't get the result necessarily you may want. You often don't see the things happen for a big period of time. And I think that lack of political literacy, coupled with this idea that a lot of other things in life happen relatively quickly, but this random grey thing doesn't. Often, you know, the change that you want to see doesn't happen for years, and there's a ton of reasons why.
Or it doesn't happen at all.
Or doesn't happen at all. And again, there's reasons why. But I think that makes people disillusioned, because again, you need to understand the system to give it the patience to let it do its thing.
But you're right, but when everything else happens fast, then it doesn't seem logical
the
why that
patience for
wouldn't.
it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we could go on down this track for a long time, but I'm going to have to try to cover some more ground. John, I wanted to come back to what you were saying about the integrity of elections, and particularly pick up on the point you made about money and elections, and we've had some questions come in on that as well. So Labour committed to, and I'm quoting, protect democracy by strengthening the rules on donations. Just interested in the Electoral Commission's view on how big a issue this is in UK elections, and what the sorts of options there would be to address the question of foreign money, because every time I think I get a grip on this, it slips away from me again.
All right, well, I'll try and help. The first thing to say is we do have very high levels of transparency and compliance amongst political parties with the rules that exist at the moment. And we have a lot of debate about whether a particular donation is the right thing for a party to accept or not. And the reason we have that debate is because all those donations are public and are available for scrutiny. And that's a really powerful thing in itself, and creates a dynamic within the system that makes people only accept things which will withstand public scrutiny. But on the specific question you're raising, there are 3 loopholes that create a risk and a perception that the system is open to serious abuse, and particularly from foreign money here. So the first one is that anybody who's on the electoral register is a permissible donor and is able to give money to a political party. And the political party has to ask them questions about whether they are permissible and satisfy themselves they're okay, but they don't have to dig deeper than that. If you were a charity or a company, money laundering regulations would require you to kind of look under the surface a bit more. Why not political parties? Doing that would add significant levels of trust, and we're confident could be implemented proportionally for the parties, so that the big ones, you'd really get the extra scrutiny, have the confidence that scrutiny has been done. The second one is any company currently registered in the UK can make a donation to a political party. And we all know there are many companies on the register who don't really do any business in the UK. They're a subsidiary of something else that's been set up for some other kind of purpose. And a simple rule that would say, well, it's not quite that simple, but a rule that says you can only donate as much money as you've made in Britain would kind of be a safeguard against that. So a small shell company would not be able to do anything. And the third one, which is a little bit more arcane, is any individuals on the electoral register can set up something called an unincorporated association. And if an unincorporated association makes a donation to a political party, no one asks any questions of where they got their money from. So if those 3 things, individual donations, company donations, unincorporated associations, were banned from taking money from abroad, then I think we could all have significant levels of confidence in the system, which currently is lacking. I mean, our polling on confidence in the transparency of the system is about as low as it can get. It's up slightly from what it was a couple of years ago, but it's very bad. So a lot of this is about giving people the assurance that someone is actually following the money and can give a straight answer to that question.
So our currently most popular question that's coming online is from Margot Mollat from Transparency International, who says, okay, we've had attention to foreign donation loopholes, but should we actually be, I'm paraphrasing here, should we be more worried about the fact that a small group of wealthy donors contribute a disproportionate share to political parties? Does this pose an inherent risk, and what should be done? And I guess the follow-on from that is if you stopped people being able to donate as much money as they liked, then how would you fund political parties?
Well, I mean, this is one of those classic wicked problems. I mean, I think our political party machine has very limited money in it compared with, for example, America and some other countries, and they've got to get their money from somewhere. We have been doing some research into what other countries have done with this, and very few have managed to do something significant without unintended consequences. So there is a live debate about donation caps and what that might look like, but I think we would say be careful what you wish for and really think quite carefully about this one. The last one I think is pretty straightforward. These are loopholes which you can close. This one needs a broader debate about how we fund our political parties in a way that enables them to do their job on behalf of the electorate properly.
Yes. Lewis, do you have a view on what a better party financing system might look like?
I've changed my views on this in the last 10, 20 years about plutocracy in particular. I used to be of the view that the billionaires are sort of sui generis and they don't necessarily favour their own interests as a class, and that they are distributed throughout the ideological spectrum. So you can probably find some rich person with the views that match to your party and it's going to be fine. I don't think that's a sustainable position anymore, and I think I was probably deluded to hold it in the first place. So I do find myself tempted by the arguments about donation caps. I'm interested that John feels that it may not be a suitable avenue, and that's a discussion that should be had. Certainly, I mean, whether corporate donations themselves are a good thing, whether it's all, because corporate donations occupy a much smaller proportion of the sort of financing of political parties than they used to, I believe, certainly compared to the 1980s. Do we need corporate donations at all? Particularly when executives and owners are so generously remunerated, they can do it from their own resources rather than corporations. The other sort of answer that sort of comes to mind is some sort of form of state funding. I realise it's not going to be an immediate popular sell on the doorstep to fund political parties, but I think there is some sort of I think it is reasonable to the parties perform functions which are serving the interests of the state and the public interest in sort of organising elections, sort of to some extent policing standards, providing a coherent or semi-coherent set of policies for the electorate. They do functions that we would miss if we didn't have political parties. So I feel they are a public good, and a per vote contribution from the state would not be a bad thing, particularly if it was associated with restricted measures under other headings.
Discuss. Very interesting. I've got a question here which seems like it might be one for you, Matteo, from Martin Vickery in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. How can we address growing concerns about violence, threats and intimidation towards candidates during election campaigns? I know the Electoral Commission did some research which really showed alarming levels of harassment.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Impound question. I think there's a lot that we can do. I think it's a difficult one purely because we're talking about kind of public debate, and it's that kind of old question of where does free speech end and kind of hate speech starts, and that's probably is something that we can spend hours debating on. But I think the one thing that we see quite often, and we did some work with the gaming community, specifically the esports community around this, because quite often when it comes to online hate or threats of violence towards candidates, what you're often seeing with particularly young people, especially young gamers, particularly as a subset, for example, is that there is a disconnect between what you'd say to someone face-to-face and what you'd say to someone online. And there's this almost like nullifying of, well, it was online, so it doesn't matter. Especially, I don't know if anyone's gone onto a COD waiting room, for example, whilst they're waiting to go onto a game, but that kind of probably tells you everything you need to know about how people view COD, for anyone that doesn't know, is Call of Duty. And those waiting rooms before going into the lobby, before going into the session of the game, is incredibly marred with hate, nasty comments, etc. And what you often see is that then transcends, and why wouldn't, to other aspects of life. So I think quite often what you end up seeing is that actually the engagements that we have on places like Discord or on places like online games or whatever, that then transcends to other, arguably more important facets of life, like talking to candidates online or essentially harassing them, effectively. And I think this is where media literacy really comes into the fold, because it's about helping people essentially understand that actually your comments online can be just as painful as if you say something to someone at a pub. The difference, of course, is that if you say something to someone at a pub, there might be some pretty immediate repercussions. Whereas if you're doing it online, there arguably are none. And I think there's a bit of work there to be done about actually changing the narrative of what does it mean to have conversations online, which will in the long run help people understand that actually this is not okay, and you should be calling out your friends in the same way that you'd call them out if they were to say something in the street.
Yeah, and I think that's, as you say, how you actually change that narrative with people, if that's the primary point at which you have to engage with them in those sorts of contexts. That's the tricky thing. I mean, have you tried to do interventions in those sorts of spaces? Yes,
we do a lot of media literacy interventions. Specifically, I mean, we did quite a bit of work with the Home Office in various places, specifically with young people that are, for lack of a better term, at risk of radicalisation, often with either the kind of white nationalist or online misogyny kind of space. And with that, it's often, again, about intervention before they go down that road is a lot cheaper and a lot easier. It's the idea of, prevention is cheaper than kind of cure. And actually, I think going into schools, going into pupil referral units and teaching about critical thinking skills, teaching about emotional resilience and the conversations and how to have conversations online early doors, or early ages, sorry, will mean that we will hopefully start to see less and less of those kind of conversations and people calling each other out on those kind of conversations in later life. So I think it's an investment that needs to happen early stages for that to change.
Okay. I'm struggling with a number of different topics I want to cover here to make this sound completely coherent. So I'm just going to ask one last question to Jane, and then I'm going to come to the audience, because I can see loads of brilliant people in the audience who I'm sure have questions that they would like to ask the panel. Jane, as John mentioned at the start, of course, we've got devolved elections coming up well before we probably have another general election in the UK.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have different systems for our elections in Wales and Scotland. So what do you think are the lessons in terms of the sorts of themes we've been talking about that Westminster and the UK system ought to learn from what we see in the devolved systems?
These are really difficult questions, Hannah. Because if you think about kind of what our electoral system affects. This is a classic question, by the way, if you ever study politics at an undergraduate level, right? What are our electoral system effects? So on the surface of it, you'd say more proportionate systems tend to lead to more consensual kinds of politics, more coalition-based frames of government, can also be correlated with higher turnout, participation, and can make people feel represented, right? So these seem like really good things. But when you then drill down into whether or not those electoral system effects are causal, or whether countries that generally people feel better represented and they turn out at high levels and they have a different kind of civic political culture, tend to also have electoral systems that, have these kind of forms. It's very difficult to tease out whether or not these are actually going to have effects. So it's going to be incredibly difficult to learn lessons, I think, is my first kind of caveat. So you kind of want to say, oh, yeah, that's going to be really interesting. And it's like, I don't know what we'd infer from that. I mean, one of the fascinating things to me was in 2010 and then 2011. So 2010, we had our coalition government for the first time under a majoritarian electoral system that isn't supposed to deliver coalition governments. And then in Scotland, the next year, we had our first majority single-party government in a system that's supposed to create coalitions. So can we say that a more proportional system in Scotland has delivered a better, more consensual political culture? Well, then you bang in independence, a hugely divisive question, and obviously that's all exploded, right? Because you can't possibly look for an electoral system effect there. But nevertheless, I still find these things really interesting. And I think one of the lessons that we can probably take, certainly in Wales, is that when you change a system, it will be fascinating to see how quickly people learn, because I think one of the barriers, right, that people have, and I don't quite know where my position is on electoral reform, to be honest. I'm not quite sure where I stand on it. So I can see lots of arguments both ways. But one of the arguments against electoral reform is simply that people are used to working within this system and that it's going to be confusing, it's going to disenfranchise people, or it's going to lead itself to all sorts of unintended. And I think, people are going to learn very quickly how to vote in that system. They'll do that because, those people who are wanting to participate in politics will figure it out. They'll be told a million times, by leaflets and canvases and everybody else, and they'll be given a lot of information. So I'd assume that, I mean, my basic default with the electorate is the electorate's smart, really, really clever, and I mean, not every single person, obviously, but but generally speaking, I have a great faith in electorates. I feel the system fails them or us more than the other way around, and I think voters will respond very positively. But we won't necessarily see automatic lessons, and we won't automatically, therefore, be able to infer some really core lessons for Westminster elections. Despite lots of people will want to do that, I think.
It's still important to look. OK, we're going to take some questions from in the room. My colleague Lauren has a roving mic. Please do tell us who you are. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions together. If your question is to a specific member of the panel, please say so. We'll try to avoid everyone answering everything. So panellists, please feel free to answer the questions you most want to answer. There's a lady down here in the front row.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Jane's point, actually, but also...
Do you mind telling us who you are?
I'm sorry, Susanna Damon. I'm chair of the board of Make Votes Matter, the campaign group for proportional representation. And my question, obviously, connects directly with that. But I was interested in the discussion we had earlier on the disengagement of young people. Because what we have noticed at MVM recently is a very much higher number of young people coming forward in the last 18 months or so. They are lively, engaged, interesting, and my goodness, they're setting the social media on fire in a way which my generation really doesn't know how to do. And I just wondered whether, because we are single issue, we are all about proportional representation, does that suggest that this is a concern for young people particularly?
Great. You should take it. Blue shirt.
Hi, thank you. Steve Gosling, and I think probably my question's probably for Lewis. When you were talking about money, do you think, is there a... I'm old enough to remember when political parties were popular movements, and is there a connection between the parties being so hungry for money that they have lost enthusiasm for gaining members?
Great, and over here.
Thanks. Adam Roberts, MHCLG. You've talked about integrity and safeguarding. How, if at all, do you think that issues are different for mayoral elections? Is there any evidence that they might be in a sweet spot where interference of various kinds is worthwhile because mayors have enough power to be a prize, and where interference is also achievable because you're not having to mislead or deter across more than one region of the country?
Great. OK, so we have a question probably for Jane on electoral reform, one for Lewis on money versus members, and one, I think, definitely a starter for you, John, on the mayoral system and integrity. And Tanya, you can jump in on any of those that you wish to. Jane.
Thanks so much for the question. I can't give you a direct answer, so I don't know if it's true that young people are more pro-PR. What I would sort of perhaps suggest, though, is obviously there's a selection effect going on here, that the people that choose to come to talk to you. But what we're seeing in the electorate more profoundly, I think, which I think speaks to these issues of disengagement and so on, and the problems that are coming down the track, is a very, very significant divide amongst younger generations between those who have degrees and those who don't. So if I kind of worry about one... So this is my indirect way of coming back to you, which is I suspect these people are pretty highly educated. And therefore, that concern that the system is broken, but these people have high feelings of efficacy, so they feel like they can make a change, they can get involved, they can come talk to you, maybe they care about the electoral system, maybe they care about something else, right? Those people are just, they're a group. And that's great, that's wonderful. But it's the people who aren't in that group, who are not going, it's not about university, it's about social divides, right? There's gulf that's emerging, more and more so, between graduates and non-graduates, those people that participate further or higher education and those people who don't. And we're just seeing this enormous gulf. And so just as an opportunity for me to kind of jump off your question and say that's what really worries me, those people who feel very let down by the system, they're ripe for going to the radical right, they're ripe for being disengaged from politics, and for having that level of cynicism, susceptibility to misinformation, feeling aggrieved to the point that they feel so furious and angry that society has left them behind that they're willing to go and, do all the wrong things, as well as feel, have very, very poor outcomes in their future. So I'm just saying, I suspect they're very highly educated, feel a strong sense of efficacy. The problem is they're not representative.
Yes.
Right. If I can put my oar in briefly on the electoral system point, I think what the electoral system currently does is two things, both badly. It distributes voice and legitimizes voices, and it distributes control over the government. And I think the two things are different. You can have a reasonably majoritarian system to determine who runs the government. But what we're doing at the moment is we're shutting out a lot of voices with significant support in the electorate. I mean, the Green Party is perhaps, and Reform as well, are part of this. People feel unrepresented and disenfranchised, and the system does nothing for them because they don't see very often people in Parliament saying stuff that they want. So I think we need to think about how the voice, how participation in the national conversation is related to both to participation and attitudes and to the electoral system. Steve's point about members, yeah, I mean, party membership is a shrunken remnant of what it was sort of 50 years ago. Parties used to have million-plus members, the big parties. And I think while I am nostalgic for those days, I don't think they can come back, really, because people don't join stuff in the same way. I mean, sociologically, people don't join organisations and voluntary bodies the way they used to. And also, I think people have higher expectations from membership. If you're a member of a political party, you tend to want a bit of control over what the party does. You tend to want to vote in the leadership election or a say about policy. And in the 70s, for instance, people were happy not to have either and be members of the Labour and Conservative parties. So I think there are sort of questions of balancing the wishes of members that tend to be a bit further from the mainstream of public opinion than the parliamentary parties that they're involved in. I think it's problematic. And I think it's quite interesting that our sort of newest big party, Reform, does manage to have an individual membership with next to no power. And it's designed around it's designed so that members don't have very much power. But they seem to be still recruiting members at quite a rate. So perhaps if the party is offering something people feel sufficiently enthusiastic about, they can recruit. And you can point back to Labour under Corbyn as well as having a high and rising membership for that period. So I think, again, be careful what you wish for with mass membership.
Thank you. John?
Briefly, if I may, on those points, I mean, it is an interesting time because arguably there are no safe seats anymore. And some of these issues about lack of voice were from the time when this was a Conservative seat, this was a Labour seat, and forget it if you're anybody else, and forget it if you're the other one here. And what's happening at the moment is we are hearing much more loudly Green voices, Reform voices. They have got representation in Parliament. So there is a chance within our system. I think, as Jane says, the system itself creates unusual or unintended results. And on the issue of membership, I mean, we don't see mass membership kicking off a little bit with Reform, but we do see things like crowdfunding starting to affect political parties. So there's a kind of market going on here where the parties are trying to think, well, how do we connect with audiences in a way that's going to make us successful, that in itself generates innovation. But anyway, the question that Adam asked for me was about mayors. And with the nature of mayor campaigns and local authority campaigns is different because it's personal. In a sense, that was one of the remedies to some of the problems of politics being somehow not about us. If you've got an individual who's standing, you can think, right, well, is this person someone who I believe in? We've seen this play out in this month's elections, but in some of the other mayoral elections we've seen before. But alongside that, there is a challenge with mayoral elections of whether they are actually representing a community that people feel part of. I mean, Bristol would be an example where you think of Bristol, it's a city that ought to have had a mayor, and then they had one, and then they didn't want it. And so the whole system is still quite new in Britain. It's quite well evolved elsewhere, and I think we're learning. London seems pretty well established. Manchester seems to be doing quite well. Some of the others are now kind of building on things that have worked in the past. But I think the key difference, and I think your point was about people understanding party messages. A lot of the mayors, particularly last year, were successful because they pretty much stood against their own party. And I think this personality around the mayor, which is intentional, gives us an interesting contrast with what plays out on a party-based election.
Very interesting. Okay, another round of questions. I think we'll get one more round in before we end. The gentleman on the...
On the point that young people...
telling us who you are?
Oh, sorry, Nicholas Stevenson from Onward. On the point that young people want to be informed kind of before they vote, to what extent is this actually to kind of do with an increased kind of political and media literacy driving an increased understanding of spin, bias and manipulation, and thereby kind of driving apathy as a consequence?
Thank you. Good. 2 questions there.
Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy. A question for Matteo. Do you think votes at 16 can be a success without automatic voter registration? And if there isn't automatic voter registration for 16-year-olds, isn't this simply going to lead to a further drop in participation in elections?
Thank you. And then next you.
James Bolton-Jones from Spotlight on Corruption. Just to dig quickly into the discussion earlier about company donations, I guess one issue with the suggestion from John around only accepting donations from companies which turn a profit in the UK is that it wouldn't stop, for example, Elon Musk making a big donation through a UK subsidiary of, say, Tesla or X. So I was wondering what panelists thought about maybe you could ban donations outright from companies, or you could maybe only allow donations from companies with a UK ultimate beneficial owner.
Okay, that sounds like a technical one for you, John. And then, so further digging into the question about party funding, Tom's question to Matteo about whether there's needs to be a complementarity between votes at 16 and automatic voter registration, and Nicholas's question about whether being apathetic as a young person is to do with awareness of spin and the way in which politics works. Who would like to kick off?
Well, shall I start off with James's question? I mean, I think that the way I introduced the topic suggested that we really need to think about exactly what we're legislating for if and when we do this. And I think with the company point, particularly thinking who you want to bite on. I mean, the words I used weren't quite the words that you used back because of the need to really tease out the consequences of each of these things. I think we need to work with organisations like yours and others that have seen how this plays out in other jurisdictions to think what sort of thing is likely to work and give public confidence in the way it's working. And I'm sure as and when a bill comes before Parliament, there'll be a really lively debate about what the precise legislative wording needs to be to deliver the result that we want. So conversation to be continued, I think, on that one.
Matteo, do you want to take the votes at 16?
No, I think it's an interesting question because I think the obvious answer is that anything that we can do to make it easier for 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and frankly anybody to vote would naturally, I think, increase participation. I think that's an obvious one. If any action you do, the less frustrations you have to do that action, the easier the action is to take part. I think that's an obvious point. That said, I do think that with 16 and 17-year-olds, or with young people in general, you're dealing with also something else. You're dealing with the fact that we need to inspire a generation to engage with a political system that, like we said earlier, can be slow, can not necessarily come back with the changes you want immediately. It may not ever come back with the changes you want. But it's the idea of civic participation that I think will be built, like the want to participate, or the feeling that participating will actually shape your future or be good for our society, all of those come in through political literacy. So although, removing the need to register to vote is an obvious easy thing to do, in the sense that, not easy thing to do, of course, but it removes that additional step to voting, which obviously makes things easier. It's not going to necessarily guarantee that 16 and 17-year-olds are going to engage. Because the ones that will arguably engage will probably engage if they need to register to vote anyway. The argument is, how do we get the people that aren't going to engage at all to then start to vote and engage with the system? And I think that comes from demystifying the system. I think it comes from political education, helping them understand why democracy is fragile, why it needs to be protected, amplified, improved, engaged with. And I think from that, obviously, if we feel that automatic voter registration is a good step to, again, ease that burden of engaging with the system, then so be it. But I think it's a whole plethora of things that need to happen, which one big aspect of that is education, is political literacy. But obviously, as I said, it will, of course, make things easier, so I think it's a no-brainer.
Jane, can I ask you a very quick answer on Nicholas's question? Or any of those questions, in fact.
So the cynicism or the misinformation, the spin, the bias that you're talking about, and I think your question is saying, are young people responsive to that in a different way, or are they particularly noticing that or something? So I think our big problem is that everybody pretty much feels negative about the system, right? You'll find some people that won't say that, but that's the biggest problem. It's just a universal set of assumptions now about the system being broken. And if you look at a party like Reform, who are maximising that sort of sense of disenfranchisement and alienation, they're picking up older voters at the moment, those voters who aren't the older part of the working age population. And there's interesting reasons for that. So no, I don't think it's that. I don't think that young people in particular are seeing something wrong with the system. I think that's universal. I think what's changed, just really briefly, is that it's the older generations that are different, right, in a way. So older generations just had a greater attachment and habituation with the system that young people aren't coming to have. And so if we do introduce votes at 16 and 17, you get a low salience, high disillusionment election. That's going to have a long-term impact on those people not participating. You put that young people's voting into a high-stakes, high-intensity election, then that's going to have an impact on turnout going in a positive direction. The problem we have right now is the disillusionment, right? So anyway, so I don't think that's quite what's going on. I think the problem's just so much broader.
Okay, I've got one last question which I really want to ask, so apologies for running over. This is to each of the panellists. I'd like them each, in a single sentence, to tell me if they could change one thing about the way the 2029 election is run, what happens at that election, what would it be? John, I feel certain you have many answers to this, so I'm going to make you go first.
No, I have one. The saddest thing I've seen in this job is the number of really good potential candidates, particularly women, who will not stand again because they don't want to put themselves or their families through the awfulness that it is to go out campaigning and just do your civic duty on the doorstep. Let's change that.
Thank you. Lewis?
I'd quite like to see the trialling of an incentive voting system whereby you get 10 quid or something for doing the civic duty, just to see what would happen. And if it works and improves participation, then great.
Maybe the first time you vote, you get your incentive.
Not quite sure how to follow that. I would say I would love to see a greater level of political and media literacy in the run-up to that general election, so be it delivering in schools and colleges, where teachers are able to, again, teach this kind of stuff and be able to help people understand what it means to vote and engage.
Okay, so I just want the closure of the loopholes on foreign funding into political parties, and I also, with my British Polling Council President hat on, I would also like to see non-party campaigners register, and for there also to be a very tight piece of legislation around the possibility of foreign actors influencing elections, just because I think that's the very thing that probably will be most likely to happen before 2029 and will cause greater erosion of all that trust that we're all talking about.
Excellent. Well, good selection of things there. We're going to have a video and sound recording of this event up on our website extremely rapidly. It's been excellent, so please do recommend it to all your friends to watch back. And please do join me in thanking the excellent panel.